Attention. The views and opinions on this show are not necessarily those of Axe Ministry, Axe Media Group, and or their affiliate and subordinate ministries and or nonprofits. So now, here to talk about all kinds of things when it has to do with crime and such, Dr. Steve Albrecht. Take it away.
Thanks, Matt. Welcome to Crime Time and podcast episode 45. I'm Dr. Steve Albrecht, and I'm joining you from the Axe Media Group studios in Springfield, Missouri. So for this hour, I'll be talking to you about prison interviews that I have done with 3 convicted workplace violence murderers. As part of my research and the prevention of workplace violence, I've interviewed 3 men who have killed people that they had worked with, or that they killed people that were doing their jobs at the time. We know what they did. We have to ask why they did it, and I have asked them these questions. One of the issues that comes up with these types of people is, and people ask me this a lot when they realize that I've interviewed these guys in prison, is are they sorry for what they did? And the answer is sort of. They're sorry for what happened to them in terms of the criminal justice process. They're sorry for where they ended up in prison for life. And one guy, what I'll talk about is Scott DeCry. He's got like an 800-year sentence. So they're upset about where they are, where they ended up. But I don't think there are any of the 3 guys that I've talked to that did these crimes were actually upset about what happened. And that's kind of the tragedy of the whole thing, of course. So for this hour, we'll be talking about workplace violence perpetrators and really the why question, why they did what they did. So thanks for listening to Crime Time, where we talk about crime and crooks and cops and personal security. We'll talk about some dangerous people and lots of heroes. We'll even mention a few stupid crooks. Most importantly, I'll talk to you about what you can do to keep yourself safe, your family safe from crime and violence. And as always, you need to be vigilant at home and in your neighborhood and in your community and at school, if we ever go back to school, at work or on the road. And this show exists to make you feel more empowered, more secure, and more educated on security issues, personal security, and also the criminal justice system. So as background, I worked for the San Diego Police Department for 15 years as a patrol officer, a reserve sergeant, and a domestic violence investigator. I handled 1,500 DV cases in my time span there in the 6 years that I was doing domestic violence investigations. That'll be a future topic on another show about how domestic violence oftentimes crosses from home to work and what we can do about it, and how those significant situations come up when somebody says, if I can't have you, nobody else can. I now work as a training consultant. I teach training workshops, webinars, live programs. I focus on human resources and employee coaching, workplace violence prevention, school violence, hospital violence, library violence. That's another topic for another show, is what happens at the local library. I've written 23 books on business and workplace violence and police subjects. I wrote 3 books on guns. You can find those books on Amazon Kindle. It's called Albrecht on Guns, Albrecht on and Farrow on Guns, my partner Mike Farrow, and then a 3rd volume of Albrecht on Guns. So there's 3 of those on Amazon Kindle that you can find as well. All my books are on Amazon. You can always reach me at my website, which is crimetimeradio.com. You can send me an email, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm there as Dr. Steve Albrecht, and you can follow me on Twitter. I'm a big Twitter guy, Dr. Steve Albrecht, at Dr. Steve Albrecht on Twitter. And I'm always interested in what folks have to say on Twitter. You can find past episodes of the show on SoundCloud and new episodes of the show on the Axe Media Group's YouTube channel. So as part of my training and my research and my writing background and my publishing work in workplace violence prevention and school violence, healthcare violence, and mass attacks, mass shootings, I've interviewed 3 workplace murderers in prison. And part of the reason for those interviews was they exist. These guys survived. And if you look at the stories that you have seen about, the Las Vegas shooter or the Columbine perpetrators or any of these cases that have gone back to the 90s when these things really started up, most of these perpetrators kill themselves or are killed by the police or engage in something horrible we call suicide by cop. I just saw a case yesterday at the White House where somebody pulled a weapon or a simulated weapon, we're not sure yet, on a Secret Service uniformed division officer who shot him and wounded him. That's an example of suicide by cops. That guy's standing in front of the White House in front of an armed federal agent, and that's the guy that wants to get shot based on his behavior of pulling a simulator or an actual weapon we don't know. So suicide by cop is one of the ways that these perpetrators go out, or they kill themselves as soon as the police arrive. The big shift in the police response to workplace violence or school violence happened after Columbine. And that was in 2000, I think 99 or 2000 of April, when these perpetrators in the Columbine High School in Colorado, the model back then was for the police to respond with a a SWAT team or a primary response team and have them set up a perimeter until those guys could get there and gear up and put on their tactical vests and their camo uniforms and storm the building. Well, after Columbine, that response certainly changed. We didn't want to sit inside or sit outside of a building while the kids inside were being killed in the school, and now we have what's called the active shooter response. So the active shooter response now means that cops are going to engage with these perpetrators pretty regularly in these cases, and we tend to have, you know, 1 or 2 of these every month in the United States, a varying degree, either a mass attack where several people are injured or killed, or a one-off type of a situation where there's a shooting where the police get there and the perpetrator is still there. So the response to these things are going to be dramatic, and these perpetrators usually kill themselves or are killed by the police. These 3 guys that I interviewed, survived. So let me tell you about the first guy. In 1992 in San Diego, there was an employee of General Dynamics. He was a missile mechanic, an ICBM mechanic, named Robert Mack. Robert Mack shot and killed the HR manager that was working on his termination and shot and paralyzed his boss, who later died. He showed up at a termination meeting. He was given the 2 S's during the termination meeting: sit down and shut up. Literally, that's what he was told. In that termination meeting, he was going to be fired for attendance reasons. He was a 25-year employee of General Dynamics. He was fired for attendance reasons. And you say, okay, why would a guy be fired for attendance reasons? Well, it's easiest. In looking at the human resources piece of this, it's easy to fire people for attendance. They either are late or show up late or don't clock in or clock in incorrectly or have a pattern of tardy behavior or late behavior or absenteeism over the span of their time. And that was Robert Mack's problem, was he had an absentee issue, and he was always sort of goofing off on the job. As a 25-year employee of General Dynamics, he felt pretty entitled to that. As a result, he was given a suspension. And on suspension, which happened over Christmas in '91, he received a letter from the organization that he thought was going to say, come back to work in January and welcome back. And it actually said, come to this termination meeting in January and we'll fire you to your face. That was a union situation that he had, that they had to give him notice that he was going to be terminated. So he was going to be terminated at this meeting. He actually showed up an hour and a half late, which is sort of ironic, isn't it? He showed up an hour and a half late to a meeting that he was going to be fired for being late all the time. He was driven to the General Dynamics plant, the headquarters in San Diego, the manufacturing headquarters, which is down by the airport. It's on Pacific Highway right next to the San Diego airport, by his girlfriend. And she apparently missed all the warning signs. He said things like, you know, here's where the checkbook and all our money is, and I've left all of my jewelry in the drawer, and it's on the top drawer, and you can find it at home. And she's like, okay. And he said, you know, I won't need a ride home. And she's like, all right. And so she missed all the warning signs of a guy that's going to commit suicide at the scene. She just missed all that. During the termination meeting, he was given the 2 S's, sit down and shut up. He got really, really angry. And so that was part of the learning lesson for me in talking to a guy like that, is what's the strategy for those types of people when they're furious? And the answer is to let them talk, let them vent. Let them vent and tell their story and get it off their chest, what they're angry, what they feel vengeful, what they feel revengeful about, and hear them. And validate their concerns. Say things like, I hear you, and that sounds tough, and we're going to try to do the best we can for you, and we have a plan for you in terms of how we're going to ease your transition from the organization. We appreciate your service here, and things that validate these people's concern. He didn't get that. He got sit down and shut up. So during the termination meeting, he was going to shoot himself. He originally brought the gun that he purchased, swapped some cocaine for earlier that day. The termination meeting happened, I think, around 1 or 2 in the afternoon. And he was going to shoot himself, but he got really angry, and he changed his mind. And as the meeting was wrapping up, he pulled out the gun, and he shot the HR guy, and he shot his boss, and the rest we know. The police showed up, and it was almost going to be a SWAT mission, that type of a hostage type of a thing, but they talked him into giving himself up after he spoke to his mother. So he did this in January of '92. I interviewed him in prison in San Luis Obispo in March of '93. And so my first conversation with him in March of '93 became the centerpiece for a book I wrote called Ticking Bombs. And the Ticking Bombs book came out in '94. It was, at the time, the first workplace violence book, business book on workplace violence. And back in those days, '94, most of our cases, and I wrote the book with the San Diego police psychologist, a guy named Michael Mantell, most of the cases were coming out of the post office, and that was the time span where the phrase "going postal" was such a popular phrase because that's where all the cases were. The idea of a mass shooting in another place involving a factory or a school or something like that was not as common. Most of these things were happening at the post office. In fact, the Postmaster General wrote the foreword for our book, a guy named Marvin Runyon, and he actually wrote the foreword for what we were talking about. So I interviewed Mac in 93, and then the book came out in 94, and then kind of fast forward a little bit, I interviewed Mac in 2013. He had moved from San Luis Obispo, where they had him there, to a correctional facility in what's called Blythe, California, which is not the end of the world, but you can see it from there. It's out in the desert. So I interviewed Mac in 93 and again 20 years later in 2013. And so you say to yourself, okay, what do you think a guy who has been in prison for 2 murders, what do you think he has learned in that time span in 20 years? And the answer is not much. So Mac is an interesting guy from the standpoint of he, again, goes back to what we talked about at the opening, which is he's upset about where he is, not what happened. He blames the organization, as many of these people do. He blames his bosses. He blames how he was treated. There's an interesting sort of irony about Robert Mack. As an employee of General Dynamics, as a 25-year employee and a union member, he's entitled to a pension. So that seems sort of odd, doesn't it? The guy gets a pension for killing 2 people at the company that he worked at. I guess by law in California, and insert your own California jokes right now. I came from that state, and it's a mess. That he can get his pension after killing 2 people that he worked for there. So when I talked to Mac, it was really about the idea that the organization did him wrong, and what you'll hear from the other 2 perpetrators that I've talked to, a guy named Larry Hansel, who shot 2 people at a place called Elgar Corporation in San Diego, and a guy named Scott DeCry, who shot and killed 8 people inside his ex-wife's beauty salon in Seal Beach, California, is the idea of revenge. These people are driven by revenge, and they feel angry about what happened, and they want somebody to pay for their anger, and they feel extremely entitled to have done what they did, and that's so disturbing about what these guys did. So my 20-year conversation with Mac, I basically said, what have you learned? I mean, the first conversation I had with him in '93, I said, why did you do what you did? And he told me. And then the second conversation 20 years later, I said, okay, what have you learned in prison? You went through all these programs. You've been through drug and alcohol counseling. You've been through 12 steps. You've been through stress management. You've been through this and that and these various, programs to get your head back on. And I guess the answer is not much. He's still in prison, and he's been in there since '92. And he, I think, is 70 years old. He's had a bunch of operations for his back. He's had a number of health issues, and the guy's still in prison in a state where they let people out of prison all the time. So it's sort of disturbing that this guy's still in prison. I don't think he's a threat to anybody, but he refuses, and I've read his parole reports, he refuses to say what the parole board wants to hear, which is, I'm very sorry for what I did. And you think about these perpetrators, and when they're sitting in front of a parole board, they say, you killed these people, do you feel regret? And the answer should be yes, I'm sorry for what I did. He refuses to say that. The second guy that I talked to is a guy named Larry Hansel. And in June 1991, one of the first workplace violence cases, even before my book came out, Larry Hansel went to a company that he had worked at and had been fired. Actually, not fired, that's wrong, laid off 2 months before. He was kind of an odd guy. He had really odd religious beliefs, and he made people very uncomfortable with his religious fervor during working hours. And he didn't understand the boundary between work and home when it came to religious conversations. Some people get really uncomfortable about his approach. So they had a reduction in force, or what's called a RIF, and they laid him off. And so 2 months later, he came back. He shot 2 of the senior executives. I interviewed him at the California State Prison in Chino earlier this year, before the pandemic. So I'll talk to you about his case, and then let me tell you about Scott DeCry. In October of 2011, Scott DeCry went to the hair salon where his ex-wife had worked. She was not an owner, but she was an employee. He shot and killed her first, and he shot and killed 7 other people. He came outside and shot another person who was actually on the phone with the cops. So I'll tell you his story. So he shot 8 people to death, and 9 total, and one of them survived from inside the beauty salon. So I'll tell you, I'll tell you Scott DeCry's story. And I interviewed him in the California State Correctional Facility at Corcoran, which is up by Fresno, where he is housed. He's doing like a 400-year term. So each of these men have survived their attacks, which is these days is pretty rare. As you can see from the media coverage in most recent mass shootings, most of these killers kill themselves or are killed by the police, or there's a suicide by police kind of a approach here. I wanted to give them the chance to tell their stories and their side of the story. And as you can guess, all three of these people don't think what they did was wrong. And in short, they're sad where they ended up, in prison for life, but not really for what they did. So that's disturbing to me. And when you think about this idea of motive, I think sometimes we're way too focused in our world, especially because of the news media, on motive. Why did this person do this? Was it bad childhood or some other situation? Is it mental illness or something like that? And the answer is motive is really hard to understand, and motive is really hard to fix. Motive could be child abuse was the motive as a child. Motive could be you broke my heart. Motive could be you fired me. Motive is really tough to fix. What we need to do to stop these perpetrators is interrupt the opportunity. Don't allow them to get into a situation where they're so angry at the organization that they want to do these things, and we'll talk about what that looks like too. So it is interesting to me when I talk to, and I've talked to a lot of crooks in my career, but when I talk to prison inmates, there's a real sort of sense there that there's a give and take there in terms of what they want versus what I want. I want the truth from them, or at least their version of the truth, and I want information from these guys. And I realize that they are trying to manipulate me. I'm not stupid, and I have a degree in psychology. I'm a pretty smart guy. I realize they're trying to manipulate me by getting things, whether it's they want money or they want privileges or they want some sort of favor or something like that on the outside. I'm careful with these guys to have really good boundaries. I don't let them manipulate me into these situations. So when I talk to them, I'm really upfront and say, what I want from you is information about your story. And the reason I'm asking you is because you're here and you're not getting out, and you have a chance to do something maybe good on your part of this horrible situation here. You have a chance to do something that you can tell people what happened, and you can tell people your version of the truth, and I'll interpret your version of the truth versus what I know. For example, I know a lot about each of these cases because I've talked to people on the outside that were involved in them. I talked to the security director of General Dynamics for the Mac case. I talked to the HR director who was targeted by Larry Hansel for the Elgar case. I've talked to the police in Seal Beach, California for the Scott DeCry case. So I can verify and validate and sort of check and balance what these guys have said to me versus what I know is to be the actual truth as well. And that's useful because, you know, there's a sense these guys have been in the prison system for a very long time. Robert Mack's been in prison for what, almost 30 years and 28 years, and Larry Hansel's been in prison for 29 years, and Scott DeCry has been in prison since 2011. So these guys are involved in the prison lifestyle, the culture, which we call prisonization, which really turns them into sort of the manipulative people that can try to keep themselves alive by manipulating other people all the time. I'm careful when I have those conversations with those guys to not let them do that to me. So one of the things I look at for all these guys, and you know, Mack killed the two people that he thought was responsible for firing him. Hansel killed two of the senior executives at the company that had laid him off, and Scott DeCry killed the woman who has been his ex-wife and that he accused of physically abusing their child. And they had a court appearance coming up, and after the court date, they argued over the telephone in about 8:30 in the morning before when he had dropped off his son at school. He drove over to her beauty salon about 5 hours later and killed her. And he shot the other people, killed the other folks in the beauty salon for no apparent reason. When I asked him why he did it, he said, I didn't see them as a threat. I didn't see them as dangerous. They weren't stopping me. They weren't going to harm me. I just did it anyway, and I don't know why. So when I look at the motives for these guys, and I don't like to focus on it, but I look at the themes and the motives for these guys, the biggest one is the desire for revenge. You broke my heart, you injured my child, you fired me, whatever it happens to be, the desire for revenge is really strong in these perpetrators. The second thing is there's a sense of entitlement. I'm allowed to do this. I have a gun. I can come in and take over this room. I can scare all these people. I'm allowed to do this. And that's the sense they have of entitlement. And also there's just a whole blame the victim, blame the system kind of an approach. They blame the company. In two of the cases, they blame the victim. Scott DeCry blamed his ex-wife, certainly. So there's a blame which is focused and redirected not on their own actions, certainly, but on the actions of who they killed. The fourth part is there is some sort of a plan. When you look at all three of these guys, they had a pretty detailed plan. Larry Hansel drove his car to Elgar Corporation. He parked about a block away, his truck. He took his bicycle out of the back of the truck. He put on a backpack which was filled with pipe bombs and Molotov cocktails, and he had a bandolero, kind of like a army soldier has a shotgun bandolero wrapped around his chest, and he rode his bicycle to the facility. I mean, he had a plan. Scott DeCry knew what his wife was going to be working. He showed up at her facility with 3 guns. He had a 44 Magnum, like Dirty Harry, like Clint Eastwood. He had 2 9mm handguns, and he shot all of them, including, he shot her, I think, 10 times. Robert Mack had a plan as well. He was going to stand up and make this vocalization to the board that was going to fire him, and he's going to shoot himself in front of them. They all had a plan. One of the things I look for in my cases and the work that I do for workplace violence prevention is leakage. Do these guys leak out information? Do they tell other people what they're going to do? And lots of times we see leakage. The kid that wants to shoot the football coach will tell his friends. And the critical issue there is to get these kids in the school to tell the principal or the school security or the school police or a counselor or a teacher what they have heard. That's how we stop these cases. Leakage happens all the time. If you think about domestic violence, the perpetrator says, if I can't have you, nobody else can. That's leakage. And in these 3 cases with these 3 guys, Mack, Hansel, and DeCry, no leakage. 2 of the 3 overarmed themselves. Mack had a revolver, which he traded some drugs for the day of the crime. But Scott DeCry had 3 guns, and Larry Hansel had shotguns and Molotov cocktails and pipe bombs and handguns. Actually, Larry Hansel hid one of his handguns in the facility right after he got fired. So right before he left for the final time in the facility, 2 months prior to that, he hid a gun, which he told the cops about when they got there and when they searched the building later on. He told them where this extra gun was hidden. So 2 of those 3 guys overarmed themselves in these cases, and that's pretty common as well. You see these perpetrators that show up in these mass shootings with lots of guns and lots of ammo, and they overarm themselves. Excuse me. And the last one is no remorse. Again, 2 of these guys are doing life without the possibility of parole. Mack is the 3rd guy, and he can't get parole because he doesn't know how to tell the parole board that he's sorry for what he did. So again, they're sad for where they are, but they're not sad for what they did. And that's sort of heartbreaking. So Larry Hansel, 41 years old at the time of the crime. This is June 1991, about 2:30 in the afternoon. He's hired at Elgar Corporation, and that's a company that makes power supplies for large manufacturing machines and things like that. He's hired in '88. So 2 months prior to the shooting, he's laid off from his job at Elgar Corporation, where he worked as a technician. He was nicknamed Crazy Larry Hansel. He was let go as a reduction in force, but the real reason was because he had these sort of odd religious behaviors where he would kind of make people very uncomfortable when he talked about at work. So he came to the office the morning of the shooting, and actually the shooting happened at 2:30 in the afternoon. He came in the morning beforehand, and he said, "Who is in the building?" And the secretary, the receptionist, told him who was in the building. He was looking for some senior executives. Technician. He was nicknamed Crazy Larry Hansel. He was let go as a reduction in force. But
we got something going. Sorry about that.
Odd religious behaviors where he would kind of make people very uncomfortable.
My bad.
Back on?
Yep.
So he came to the building and he asked the receptionist who was in the building. He was looking for some senior executives that he planned to kill, including the HR director, who I had interviewed and knew later on. So he returned several hours later, probably 5-6 hours later. He parked his truck nearby. He rode his bicycle to the rear of the building. He was armed with 2 shotguns. He had ammo and a bandolero wrapped around him. He had 2 pipe bombs, and one of them he created so it would make a lot of smoke. He had a handgun and then already some ammo hidden already in the facility. He set off the 2 smoke bombs in the hallways. He went to the lobby. He told the receptionist to move out of the way. He shot with the shotgun. He shot out the phone system so that she could not call 911. Inside the building, he ignored, and this is very common with these perpetrators, he ignored a lot of other people that he saw. He didn't want to shoot them. He was looking for the HR VP. He was looking for the general manager of the plant. He was looking for his own supervisor. He went to the 2nd floor where he killed the general manager of the plant, and he killed his supervisor. They were both in the same office. Then he got on his bicycle and rode back to his truck, and then he threw his bike in the back, and he drove to Palm Springs. And probably 3 hours later from the shooting, he turned himself into the Riverside Sheriffs, and they arrested him. They took him back down to San Diego, And then there was that search again for the facility. While they were searching the crime scene, they found his extra gun that was there. They also found 3 Molotov cocktails. And if you remember those are glass bottles that have gasoline and a rag in them. So when they explode, they're going to catch on fire in the building. He also created a radio-controlled bomb. He was a pretty smart guy when it came to this stuff, and which they found outside the building. So in talking to Larry Hansel, this sense of what his case was all about, I really was just interested in how much planning he put into this, and did he decide to do all this stuff with the bombs to get people to evacuate? And that was really the answer. He wanted people to evacuate the building so he could focus on the 2 people that he ended up killing. This is in our world what we would call targeted violence, which means these people have a specific target list. They want to kill the woman that broke their heart, or they want to kill the boss that fired them, those types of things. And so he intended to kill the 2 people he killed, and he would have killed the HR director if the HR director hadn't been smart enough to get out of the way and hide out. He fired all of his guns. He fired the shotgun several times, but again, he could have killed the receptionist, but he didn't. He let her live. He owned the guns prior to this incident. He was a gun guy, and he knew that he was going to use those for that particular situation. The tough part about talking to Larry Hansel is that he has severe mental illness, and so in my conversation with him, he was very specific on the actual events of the shooting. So when I look at my notes and his answers from what I asked him about the shooting in particular, he's very specific. But he continues to send me letters, which are rambling and all about John F. Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs and all kinds of stuff, which has nothing to do with what happened. So his mental illness is really quite severe. He actually had a job. He was working at another organization before this incident happened. So 2 months before the murders, he was actually working in another place. So it really is not about, I don't have any money and I'm starving to death and you're responsible for that. He had another job. He says he didn't tell anybody what he was going to do. He had a wife and kids, and she's still with him, and he has grandchildren, and he has no sort of sense of why he was let go from Elgar Corporation. He thinks it was a plot to ruin his life. They just got rid of the guy because he didn't do his work to the degree they wanted, and he had these irrational religious beliefs. I asked him how he felt immediately after the situation and the incident. I think he said he felt relieved, and he went to turn himself in because he knew there would be consequences for his behavior. I asked him what he thought the organization could do differently to have prevented this, and then basically it was not fire him. And I said, why did you give up to the police? Why didn't you kill yourself? And he wanted to be able to tell his story, and he wasn't planning to kill himself, and he knows that he would spend the rest of his life in jail. His trial back then in the 90s, was not covered in the way these things are today. I mean, it was sort of a garden variety, 2 people killed sort of a murder, and we didn't have sort of the sensational connection to workplace violence that we do now, where the news media really covers these things pretty intently. And so I've asked him, what is your sort of approach to life now that you've been in prison for so long? And the biggest thing that I get from him is that he's been trying to work these programs and trying to be a mentor to other prisoners and just do his time. But there's, again, no lesson learned. There's no lesson learned in terms of what he's doing in prison to make his life better. I've always asked these guys too, have you ever tried to apologize to the family members of the people you killed? And in his case, the answer is no. And really what happens in prison is, I didn't know this until I talked to him, is you can't contact, as a perpetrator, a murderer, you cannot contact the victims' families. It's illegal. So mostly what you do is you could write a letter to the district attorney, and they will pass it on to the family. And you can imagine that when these people come up for parole, the family members of the dead victims will show up and try to stop the parole, which has happened in the Robert Mack case for sure. And so I asked him what he thought, Larry Hansel, what he thought he could do for for guys like me who are security experts and people like, cops, what he thinks he could do to get some sense of understanding about why he did what he did. And, his answers are kind of vague. It has to do with how he was treated during the termination. It has to do with how he was treated as an employee. And I guess that goes back to sort of the larger picture for me. These guys are really about revenge. It's just so much about, you broke my heart, or you fired me, or you did something. It's all about revenge. And you think about these school kids that do these things as well. The girl that turns the guy down to go to the prom, or the teacher that was, mean to this student, or whatever it happens to be as their reason for, getting cut from the football team, as their reason for why they did what they did. So it always pains me when I look at these cases to see, that the media is focused on motive, and what we should really be focusing on is looking at the warning signs, looking at the behavioral red flags, looking at the ways to intervene in these people's lives. I mean, as well as me, when you look at our country in terms of the mental health services that people can get, either as students or college students or as employees or people that are on the street, the mental health services are not great. So a lot of these people could have used mental health services. And I asked Robert Mack, working at a big company like General Dynamics, they have something called an EAP, or an Employee Assistance Program. And the EAP provider is a therapy approach. It gives you access to 3 to 5 sessions of counseling on a variety of life issues, from marital problems to drugs and alcohol, to gambling, to finances, to legal, to cancer, and all these types of things. I said, why didn't you go to the Employee Assistance Program? And he had been a 25-year member of General Dynamics as an employee, and they had Employee Assistance Program 17 years of his time there, and he said, I didn't realize there was a program. I didn't realize it existed. Now, that could be a lie. That could be him just saying that, or it could be the actual truth that he did not know that there was a counseling service that was attached to his organization. And as a guy that works in threat assessment and workplace violence prevention, when I talk to employees that we have concerns about, or ex-employees, I always try to get some sense that there are resources available for people that need help. There are suicide hotlines, and if you're an employee, we have an Employee Assistance Program, and you can go that nobody knows that you're using those services. But sometimes people have a blind spot for that type of issue, and especially for men, it's really hard to reach out for counseling help or even suicide prevention, especially for males. In a future show, I'm going to be talking about suicides, because I think for males in their 50s, especially white males in their 50s and 60s, it's one of the highest reasons for death in our culture today. And especially now during the pandemic, people are super depressed. There's a lot of connections to suicide, and we'll be talking about that as well. So let me tell you about Scott DeCry. Very interesting guy. I met him in February, right before everything shut down in the pandemic. He's in a California state prison called Corcoran, which is up by Fresno. He shot 8 people inside the Salon Meritage and 1 person outside in the parking lot in Seal Beach, California. 1 person inside the salon survived. His primary target was his ex-wife, a lady named Michelle Fournier. She was 48, kind of about the same age as he was. He was the mother of their 8-year-old son, and they had been divorced for about 5 years. Scott DeCry had married another woman 4 years prior to the incident. He lived in a really nice house in Newport Beach, California. He had a medical condition as a result of being injured on the job. He was a merchant marine, and his leg was badly damaged, and he had retired. And he was very upset as his ex-wife for his sense of her abusing their son. His statement to me that she had physically abused the boy several times before, and he was very upset about their custody arrangement. So they had went to court in October of 2011, a couple days before the shooting. They went to court, and the judge said, okay, he had a little bit over half-time custody. I think he had the boy from like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and she had the boy from like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. He wanted full coverage, full custody of the child. So the judge said, okay, let's move this court custody decision into December. And so on a Monday or a Tuesday, that was the court discussion. On a Wednesday or a Thursday, the day of the shooting, they got into a huge argument over the telephone. He was in the parking lot of the school about 8:30 in the morning. He decided to go home, get his guns. He was going to go to the where she worked and kill her. He burst into the beauty salon. He shot her. He said something, he cursed at her and basically shot her with the guns that he had. Again, a .45 caliber, H&K semi-auto. He had a .44 Magnum Smith & Wesson revolver, the Dirty Harry gun, and he was also carrying a 9mm semi-automatic. Excuse me. He was wearing body armor at the time of the crime. He was carrying 3 guns in 3 holsters that are on his belt. At the time of the crime, he was wearing body armor because he thought the police would shoot him as soon as he fled the scene. He was arrested about a half mile from the beauty salon. He was pulled over by the cops. He gave up. He came out of the car He laid on the ground. They came over and handcuffed him. They also tasered him, even though he had said he was not a threat to them. So, again, as I said, 2 days before the shooting, they had this court appearance, and then the morning of the shooting in the parking lot of the school where he had dropped off his son, he was furious at her, and he decided that he was going to go in there and kill her. And then his whole conversation about why he killed the other people is just so sad to me. They had nothing to do with his situation. I think he knew the beauty salon owner, but other people in there were just employees cutting hair or customers getting their hair cut. And it's just so tragic to think that he took out his revenge on his ex-wife, not only killing her, but these other people as well. So he's arrested in 2011. In May of 2014, he pleads guilty. He's been in prison, or in state, he's been in custody in the Orange County Jail for 3 years. He pleads guilty. The Orange County District Attorney decides that he wants to get the death penalty for Decry. He's the biggest mass murderer in the history of Orange County, eight people dead, and screws up the case. Basically, the district attorney screwed up the case by putting an informant in his cell, and also putting a bug in his cell and wiretapping his cell, which is all got excluded. All this information was done without a warrant, and it all got excluded. Actually, Kamala Harris, who you may know from her possible acceptance of being Joe Biden's vice president, was the attorney general in California, and she took over the case. Her office prosecuted that case. So the Orange County DA screwed up the case, which actually saved Scott Decry's life, because he would have been put on death row had he been convicted of these 8 murders. He would have been sent to death row in San Quentin. Actually, because of the suppressed evidence, they took it off the table, and he was given 8 life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 7 years to life for attempted murder of the person who survived. The victims ranged in age from age 46 to age 73. So Scott Decry is never going to see the light of day again. He was given, I think the total number of years is like 800 or something years. The judge said during the sentencing, the gates of hell flew open and you emerged as the face of evil. So when you look at my approach to a guy named Scott Decry, who is an interesting guy for a psychopath. He's an interesting guy for somebody who has killed all these people. I'm not saying he's a good guy, certainly, but he's an interesting character to talk to. I'm careful to stroke his ego and to tickle his narcissistic tendencies. I know the guy's narcissistic. He wants to tell his story. I'm interested in his story. I want to hear what he has to say. I think we have a rapport that's come from these conversations. I looked at his past behaviors, his past rationalizations, his past justifications as to what he did. I looked at his life issues. He had a number of positives in his life. He had a number of negatives in his life. I looked for pre-attack behaviors. There weren't very many. He did have a plan, which he says he did not leak to anybody, including his current wife, who is still stuck beside him. He's an interesting guy to talk to. I enjoyed the conversation with him that I had face-to-face. He and I exchanged letters on a pretty regular basis. I'm not saying, again, he's a good guy, but he's an interesting guy to talk to. And in my work, I don't really sometimes get to pick the types of people that I get to talk about. These are bad guys who have done bad things, and they know that. So I'm not trying to fit the guy into a profile. I'm trying to fit him into a collection of behaviors in context. Was he doing things that security officers, security practitioners, HR people, cops, psychologists, folks like that can look at and figure out what we can learn from other cases? I belong to a group of people that have a collection of these types of interests as well, called ATAP, the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. We have about 14 chapters around the United States. We have chapters in Canada and in Asia and in Europe and in Latin America. And so we focus on workplace violence, school violence, stalking, domestic violence, and terrorism. And so this group of ATAP folks, we have about probably 2,000 or so people. We have conferences twice a year in January and August where we get together as a group and we look at what these people have done in these cases over the years. And I have presented the Scott Decry case at an ATAP, several ATAP meetings over the last year or so, just to help people focus on what this guy did. So again, for my colleagues, it's not really about motive, it's about stopping these people. It's about interrupting the opportunity so they don't get to do what they have done. And so I'm looking at the intervention tools and the ways that we can stop these guys from doing the things that they have done. So his, again, motive was his anger toward his ex-wife. towards his sense that she had abused their son physically and he wanted to get full custody. The judge had stopped that and kind of moved it ahead until December, and he wasn't going to wait that long. So I asked him a lot of questions as to why he did what he did, what his anger was towards his ex-wife, and also I was really interested in once he got arrested, how he got through the jail system in Orange County, and how he got through the prison system. And it's interesting the things that he told me about sort of the outside part of the prison system, which is the commerce in the currency in state prisons, at least in California, is stamps. In the old days, it used to be cigarettes. That's how people paid for things. But in prison, it's stamps. So that's what they use for money with each other when they buy things, or they pay off debts or gambling debts or extortion or the other stuff that happens in prison, you can guess. And also they use it to buy things at the commissary in the prison system. So whenever I send something a letter to Decry, I send him some stamps. So he has a little currency to be able to buy sodas and toilet paper and stuff like that in prison. So it's interesting how that world has worked. So when I think about these guys from the standpoint of what they did, I'm sorry for what happened. I'm sorry for the loss of life of all the people that were connected to these guys. I'm interested from a research perspective as to what I can learn from them, and I'm really hoping that my colleagues in the threat assessment world and workplace violence and school violence and healthcare violence and domestic violence can learn from these guys for what they have done. So let's talk about my favorite part of the show. It's Crime Time's Stupidest Crook of the Week. Here's where I get to talk about some of our dumbest criminals and the things that they have done to get themselves named as the stupidest crook of the week. So a would-be robber entered a Florida Wells Fargo branch in Orlando, Florida. He's wearing, this is a pandemic type of a stupid crook, which is great here. The timing's perfect. He's wearing sunglasses and white gloves and a white cone-like mask over his face. He approached the teller's window, demanded money, but the teller had trouble understanding what he was saying through his mask, and there was also I guess she had a plastic shield in front. So he repeated himself over and over and over again, and he finally got frustrated and ran off. He was later arrested via CCTV footage from neighboring businesses who saw him leave. So the tip for the next bank robbers would be to maybe take off your mask when you're making your demand for the money, because she couldn't hear him and he didn't get any dough. So that's our stupid crook of the week. Let's take your Crime Time IQ test here. Let's test your Crime Time IQ with this week's crime quiz question. Okay, ready? What city has the oldest police department in the United States? So I'll start the Jeopardy music here. What city has the oldest police department in the United States? And you're thinking, is it New York? And then, is it Boston? I think, well, the answer is Philadelphia. Philadelphia Police Department was founded in 1751 by some patriot named Ben Franklin. He had a part in that. He also founded the library system and a lot of other cool things. But Ben Franklin helped found the police department in Philadelphia in 1751. Boston came around in 1838, and in New York in 1844. I have friends on the New York PD, I have friends on the Boston PD, and I got a couple friends on the Philadelphia PD as well. So that's our Crime Time IQ test. Let's talk about your Crime Time safety tip of the week. And this week's Crime Time safety tip has to do with what you store in your car. Out of habit, a lot of people leave their garage door remote in their car. There's usually a box above your head that it's in the console up there, or some people keep it in the center console or down by the, where they keep their sodas and things like that, or it's clipped to your windshield visor. If your car is outside of your garage and you leave it outside, as some people do because their garage is full of stuff and the car can't get parked in there, all the bad guy has to do is break your window or use a Slim Jim to get into your car and press the garage door opener and get inside your garage. And sometimes, because people leave their garage doors unlocked going into the house, then this guy gets into your house. The other thing I don't want you to leave in your car, and again, it's a habit that we all often do, is your insurance card or your registration. If your insurance card or your registration, typically your registration will, but if your insurance card has your address on it, and sometimes they do, I think mine's with Geico and it does not, but if your insurance card or your registration has your address on it and the crook steals your car, he may, especially if you leave your keys in the car or he gets your keys, may drive straight to your house. If a bad guy steals your car and drives straight to your house and you were at work, let's say he's stolen the car from your work parking lot, all he has to do is pull up use your garage remote and get inside the house. So the Crime Time safety tip of the week is do not leave your garage door remote in the car. I always bring mine inside the garage and just put it on top of a table I grab every time as I go. And keep your car registration and or, if it has your address on it, your insurance information in your wallet or your purse. So having both of those things together makes it easy for crooks to get into your house if they steal your car. So that's the Crime Time tip of the week, safety tip of the week. Keep your garage door remote hidden. Also, don't leave it in the usual spaces. Don't leave it in places where obviously it can be found if your car is parked at work. And take your insurance and your car registration information with you when you go. So thanks for listening to this week's episode of Crime Time. Thanks to producer Matt for his support, and thanks for listening to Crime Time when we talk about crime and crooks. I encourage you to go to my website at crimetimeradio.com and send me an email with topics and questions that you might want me to cover in future shows. Again, I'm going to talk about domestic violence, especially as a crossover topic from home to work. We have a lot of resources about this, especially for people who are victims of domestic violence and are concerned. There's a great national hotline, which I'll talk about on a future show. I'll also talk about suicides, and I'm interested in the suicide topic, especially as people are coming out of the pandemic and feeling kind of depressed and sad about what's going on in life, and we want to make sure that folks know that there are resources for suicide prevention. And I'll also talk about police suicide, which is a strange topic because more cops kill themselves than are killed in line of duty. Typically 115 to 120 cops are killed each year in the field. Half of them die in car accidents or motorcycle or plane accidents. The other half are killed by crooks. But when we look at police suicide, more cops kill themselves than are killed in line of duty, and that's a horrible situation which we're going to talk about. So you can certainly get me on LinkedIn. Look for me at Steve Albrecht or Dr. Steve Albrecht on LinkedIn. Send me a message there, or you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Steve Albrecht. So in our world, there are sheep, and there are shepherds, and there are wolves. Too many people are sheep, and too few people are shepherds. There are a lot of wolves out there. There are not enough police officers or sheriff's deputies to protect us all. That means you need to be a shepherd. Take care of yourself, protect your family, your loved ones, your friends, your co-workers. Pay attention out there. Be prepared to defend yourself legally with force if necessary. Be a good witness for the police if you see a crime. Stay safe and aware and alert at home, at work, at school, and on the road. Thanks for listening to Crime Time. My thanks to Jim Whining, producer Matt, and all the good folks at Axe Media Group. I'm Steve Albrecht, and thanks for listening to What I Know Is Right.